Hello everyone. Today, we will learn the 5 most optimal steps to solving LSAT Logical Reasoning rule of statement type questions that were developed after analyzing more than 10,000 LR problems over 4 years while teaching LSAT at Pagoda Academy in Seoul. All right, I'll give you 30 seconds to first read and try the problem. Fighting!
Okay, so step 1 is to enclose the LSAT argument in a rectangle to remind yourself that it is a closed universe you are dealing with. You must think inside the box, in other words, and not outside like Steve Jobs. Think of each LSAT argument as a state-specific legal matter. Just as the personal injury laws of Mississippi cannot determine the outcome of a California car accident case, your outside knowledge cannot determine the outcome of an LSAT question. You must rely exclusively on facts and opinions presented in the particular argument or fact set presented before you to find the correct answer. Okay, so we have completed step 1. Please pat yourself on the back as half of the battle has already been won. For ancient Chinese wisdom says, a good beginning is half the battle. Now, step 2 is to highlight the 4 parts of an LSAT argument in their respective colors. Start with identifying the main conclusion in green, followed by background in beige, premise in blue, and subsidiary conclusion in gray. Highlight premise, conclusion indicators such as since and therefore, and transition words such as but and however in orange. Most importantly, always remember that LSAT often and deliberately have conclusion indicators such as therefore and thus not introduce the main conclusion, but the subsidiary conclusion, which is technically a type of conclusion. To assess your ability to actually understand what a dense piece of text might be saying. All right, let us identify the 4 parts. The first sentence stands out as an obvious candidate to be the main conclusion because it presents an opinion, or what law students like to call a hot take. But you cannot be 100% certain just yet, as the last sentence contains the main conclusion indicator thus. I thus need to suss out if the first or the last sentence is the main conclusion. The second sentence is a premise because it presents a fact, so highlight it in blue. Now highlight but, and thus in the third and fourth sentences because they are premise/conclusion indicators. Thus tells us that the preceding third sentence is acting as its sponsor or supporter. So the third sentence is an additional premise, and the fourth sentence either the subsidiary or the main conclusion because it is being presented as an opinion being supported by the fact presented in the preceding sentence. The final determination to make is deciding if the first or the last sentence is the main conclusion. Q Kelly Clarkson's Because of You 2005. To see which is which, take turns inserting it is because of, and that is the reason why. At the beginning of each sentence and see which arrangement produces a logical cause and effect relationship. Here, the first arrangement might read, it is because Americans, knowingly or unknowingly, have the tendency to act against their professed interests. That is the reason why. Americans often vote for sociopaths who end up harming them. This arrangement helps us understand the why behind the voting behavior. Now, let us try the second arrangement. It is because Americans often vote for sociopaths who end up harming them. That is the reason why. Americans, knowingly or unknowingly, have the tendency to act against their professed interests. The second arrangement is less satisfying in terms of understanding the why for this peculiar American character. The fact that they vote for sociopaths seems to be an effect of this bizarre character trait rather than an explanation, or a cause for why Americans often act that way. We are still left wondering why Americans might willingly elect someone to blow up the system. Is it because all high-paying manufacturing jobs, the essential building block for any healthy economy, have been excavated to China in the name of globalization? Perhaps, but one thing for certain, is that it provides more fodder to understanding how the American people's self-sabotaging tendency might have come about frustration at the perceived loss of social mobility and social status, than merely describing how Americans in fact often do metaphorically, but not really shoot themselves at the voting booth. So the first sentence can be thought of as a premise or a subsidiary conclusion, providing a possible why for this particular observation of a peculiar American behavior. That is the main conclusion. There is something wrong with their software. Below is what the argument with should look like after having completed step 2. Highlight the 4 parts of an LSAT argument. Alright, let us now move on to step 3, gisting, which is summarizing entire argument in one sentence, purely in your own words, to ensure that you have actually understood it. Let's do it sentence by sentence. Sentence 1. People's political behavior frequently does not match their rhetoric. Gisting, when it comes to electing representatives, Americans often act contrary to how they portray themselves in public. Sentence 2. Although many complain about government intervention in their lives, they tend not to re-elect inactive politicians. Gisting. Despite a significant number of Americans professing to detest Uncle Sam acting nosy, Americans also hate representatives who do nothing, even if they are not enabling Uncle Sam to be nosy. Sentence 3. But a politician's activity consists largely in the passage of laws whose enforcement affects voters' lives. Gisting, however, being a representative is mostly about coming up with more rules enabling Uncle Sam to be nosy. Sentence 4. Thus, voters often re-elect politicians whose behavior they resent. Gisting, therefore, ironically, Americans knowingly or unknowingly frequently prolong the lifespan of the very people enabling Uncle Sam to be nosy, which they profess to hate. Gisting of entire argument. Americans like to say they support representatives who have integrity, but who they actually vote for does not match that description. This is perhaps due to Americans hating Uncle Sam acting nosy. But they hate even more representatives who literally do nothing, even if a representative actually doing their job mostly entails further enabling Uncle Sam to be nosier. So Americans frequently end up knowingly or unknowingly prolonging the lifespan of the very agents of Uncle Sam's nosy behaviors, which they profess to detest. Alright, we have now completed step 3, gisting. Summarizing the entire LSAT argument into one sentence purely in my own words. Let us now move on to step 4, describe in the abstract, which is summarizing the LSAT argument purely in variables such as x, y, z, and their relationship to one another. Here, we can think that A equals inconsistency, B equals government intervention, C equals politician. We know A because while B is hated, those who do nothing are hated even more, but being C necessarily involves more B. So, when it comes to electing Cs, ironically, tons of B-enabling Cs often have their lifespan extended, which, according to the argument, serves as an example of variable A. Alright, we are now done with step 4. Describe the argument in the abstract. Let us now traverse into the finale with step 5. Eliminate incorrect answers by LSAT Holy Trinity. Recall that every LSAT incorrect answer essentially does the same thing. It commits hubris by exaggerating or otherwise misrepresenting what argument originally said in scope, certainty, or quantity. The Holy Trinity of LSATs. SCOPE is about the WHO and the what. Argument's sample could have been restricted to interviewing Ivy League students, but an incorrect answer will apply the findings to the average college student in America. Certainty is the level of confidence placed in main conclusion, which usually oscillates from could to must. Quantity concerns whether it is none, some, most, or all. Focusing on these 3 dimensions will allow early cutting of incorrect answers without having to read until the end, which will conserve energy and attention. Let's try it out, beginning with E. E. It is cited as evidence that people's behavior never stop. We can cut it never because the certainty, quantity, is too strong. Do you recall any mention of anything being non-existent or something being eternal? Even if you did not fully understand the LSAT argument, It is still possible to eliminate incorrect answers by being on the lookout for scheduled exaggerations in the LSAT Holy Trinity: scope, certainty, or quantity. Recall that every LSAT incorrect answer essentially commits the same sin of exaggerating or otherwise misrepresenting what the argument originally said in scope, certainty, or quantity. Here, argument never discussed anything arising to the level of never, so we can cut E early there. Alright, let us now move on to answer choice D. D. It is a generalization based on the claim that, stop, we can cut here because the statement in question about the American people's dislike of people who do nothing at work receives no support of its own, but is rather simply presented as a fact that could serve as a possible explanation for why Americans vote into office again the very enablers of Uncle Sam's nosy behaviors that they profess to hate. So scope is literally off because no such based on support ever materialized. Alright, let us now move on to answer choice C. C. It is offered as an example of how a politician's activity stop. We can cut here because the statement in question concerns the behavioral tendency of American voters and not the actions of elected representatives. So the scope, in this case, the subject matter, the who or the what, is off. Alright, let us now move on to answer choice B. B. It is a premise offered in support of the conclusion that voters often re-elect politicians whose behavior they resent. Okay. So we read until the end because no significant deviations in scope, certainty, or quantity took place. An answer becomes correct, much like when a girlfriend or boyfriend becomes spouse material by checking off every imaginable box, when every important part of it is backed up by argument text. Here, we know a premise offered is backed up by thus and but in the last and immediately preceding sentences. Note how but acts not as a rebuttal of the previous sentence, but, much like salt and pepper, enhancing meat flavor, as clarification/elaboration of a politician's job description, so as to, in conjunction with the statement in question, provide a plausible reason to believe that American voters re-elect people who end up hurting them from time to time. Alright. Let us now move on to A. It describes a phenomenon for which the argument's conclusion is offered as stop. In LSAT Logical Reasoning, the main conclusion by definition cannot provide support for any other statement, as it would then become subsidiary conclusion. So the scope is off here as it is describing a function that main conclusions cannot fulfill. Alright, that concludes our study of role of statement. I hope you found today's lesson useful. Thank you for subscribing and liking the videos. Apply the 5 most optimal steps we learned today to as many role of statement questions as you can find. The secret is to solve multiple questions of the same type in a row so you can identify patterns and common pitfalls. Remember that LSAT is a standardized test, which means every administration must test the exact same concepts and skills as the one immediately before. Thus, thoroughly understanding each and every problem of a particular question type is the key to mastering that category, along with reading the British weekly news magazine, The Economist, Shakespeare, and US Supreme Court opinions the first thing in the morning every day to improve your raw reading ability. Best of luck on your LSAT journey.